I mean, a common theme that tends to arise specifically for us as Māori around, the events of colonisation and the consequences of that today, and what that means, particularly surrounding the housing crisis. So we can directly attribute, that in terms of the housing conditions and the poor kind of quality of living for Māori is an outcome of that system. And we're seeing, not even just for Māori now, like you said, poor working families, low socioeconomic communities who are living also in severe housing deprivation. So there's a lot of kind of structural events. We can talk about the economic and social restructuring in the 90s as an outcome of, the neoliberal and colonial project that essentially 30 years later is still so entrenched within our system that now we feel those kind of consequences. So, yeah, many different facets in the way in which we can understand the way in which colonisation has influenced the way in which we live today. Yeah, I think it's actually really new to me over the last few years, and particularly because I've spent a year in England studying, understanding the housing market, but thinking about the way in which those synchronicities have influenced, right, the global kind of markets surrounding housing. And so we not only see it under, the influence of Thatcherism and then in the US, and then how it's in Aotearoa. For me, that was mind-blowing, right? And not being, I guess, aware of the colonial project globally and how that has manifested in terms of, just the conditions that we have today. So, yeah, thinking at that global scale, it was really frightening for me to understand. I was like, wow, this influence and how it is still embedded in our housing system today. It's such a sad reality. But I think there's ways in which we can understand how, neoliberalism has socially engineered through our systems and continues to perpetuate the way in which we address or try and attempt to address some of these issues where, the market, that kind of notion around the market will deliver essentially, and those types of rhetorics and stories that we hear. But actually, what does it mean in terms of how we rethink this concept of from a house to a home, and rethink the way in which we move from housing or homes being a commodity, right? And how do we decommodify and unlearn a lot of that thinking that has become so normalized in our housing system today? So, yeah, there's a lot of things that perhaps many New Zealanders aren't aware of, but we can shed light and be like, actually, this is where this idea has stemmed from. This is the whakapapa of how we have essentially been able to enable the market to, essentially act as a speculative vehicle for wealth creation for the rich. So lots of, concepts that we can unpack just within that notion. Yeah, I agree. I'm pissed off, which is why I got into this space. As a young Māori who is essentially well-educated, I can't afford to buy a home, right? And seeing the way in which housing has just been a vehicle to, grow wealth for the rich is such a sad reality, but also the importance for us to think about, centering human rights for the way in which we understand housing for everybody. So, yeah, I'm pissed off, and I see our generation, even like through the movement of the climate crisis and this housing crisis, and the way in which they essentially compound together, and the realities of that, and how that's just like affecting whānau across Aotearoa. Is like this is at the forefront, and we know that we need to do something together to address these issues. So, yeah, I think we're building momentum, and it's great to see more young people in this space, not just housing, but, across, being involved in more activism to ensure that, holding people to account for the decisions that they're making, and ensuring that we have a voice at some of these tables to ensure that, we're protecting not only our generation, but generations to come. So, yeah, lots of kind of movement and mobilizing going on in this space. Yeah, I really struggle with this concept of affordable homes. And mainly because there's there's a lot of inconsistency in understanding actually what that means. And it varies for different groups. but also that there's no really agreed kind of concept around what that actually means. People talk about 30%, you know, around our incomes to ensure that they have access to affordable homes. Actually, what is, you know, established as affordable isn't affordable. Like, the reality is in this market that it is just outstripping a lot of the earning capacity that whānau have. So it's something that I'm working with my team at Pūranga Kura to explore, and essentially like looking at different models to be able to contribute to the range of solutions that need to be delivered. So, for example, you know, some of the more recent innovations around like marae-based innovations where, for example, we worked with Papakura Marae who have built kaumātua houses and have tailored to essentially the rent that is genuinely affordable for elders. So that would be, you know, a different approach. Same through restoring our papa kāinga, being able to support those who are building on Māori land, to think about what that could look like and reconnect whānau to those lands. We can talk about other ways in which we produce, yes, youth housing or student housing, you know, so there is a diverse portfolio or options. And I think that is part of the key issue, that there aren't many options to access. And it's the same with public housing, still really slow, a lot of work to us to do, but that is such an important part of ensuring that whānau have security, right, and stability that is long-term. So, yeah, I think there's a range of different ways and pathways that we can, you know, navigate to support different whānau and individuals. No, I definitely think everybody has a role, and I talk about this more specifically in the context of te tiriti, right, for tangata whenua, for Māori and for non-Māori, and the roles that different actors have either within those different spheres or in the relational together, working together. So there's different ways in which actors can contribute to, you know, the diverse options that are available, whether it's for both Māori or non-Māori, and then for Māori that is by Māori, for Māori, right? So, and that can be both private actors and Māori. So there's a lot of partnerships. Everyone has a role in supporting them. And actually, some of the most innovative solutions that I've seen have been between Māori and the private sector as well. So there's a lot of opportunity to collaborate and address a lot of these issues. But we were talking about earlier, these other elements that come into play, you know, being able to have those wraparound services that many wouldn't have access to if it was just a, you know, standalone home without that community. Thinking about cultural connections as well. And so thinking about reciprocity and building those things rather than, yeah, just living in isolation in your individual dwelling. So really fostering that collective kind of effort to ensure that people are connected and have a sense of belonging. So yeah, there's different ways in which, and I guess it depends who you talk to as well, who might prefer one or the other as well. So, yeah. Yeah, I think obviously I have a landscape architecture background, so I'm really biased on this, right? And so I'm familiar with Earth Song in terms of its structure and living in community, taking land out of the kind of process, right? And protecting that as a part of the process, but having access to marakai and food to share, to grow. And so I'm really big on integrating, you know, these other elements outside of just the home and thinking about, yeah, relationships and affordability like this as an example, and being able to, I guess, bring the community feel in terms of the way in which we grow communities, essentially, because a lot of the new developments that we see are, you know, by super lots, and they're quite fragmented, and the master planning is perhaps could be better to think about these other amenities that we need to have access to. So no, I'm really big on that as a model as well. You know, that as a model isn't unfamiliar to Māori communities and how we traditionally lived in our papakainga, you know, close to whānau, being able to all watch tamariki, you know, playing in spaces, thinking about car parks where you would have, you know, shared my kuia from home had talked about, having the shared bus, or is it a van that goes to the supermarket together on a Sunday, growing kai together in the orchards that we used to have. And so all those fundamental things that are so important to our cultural well-being, access to our maunga, to our moana, for food, for mahinga kai, from our awa in terms of our streams, and, even our papakainga up home is still, it generates the electricity. So these aren't really new, right? But I think there is an appetite to be able to restore our papakainga, or the notion of kainga, in the way in which we live. And it's not just within, rural communities, but it can be woven into our urban fabric as well. So, yeah, I think there's hope and aspiration to reimagine the places and our environments that we live in today. So for me, that's really exciting. Think about this with a design lens, right, and the subtle design elements that we can facilitate these relationships, because essentially that's what landscape architecture and urban planning is. We think about high fences is a really good example as well, in terms of how homes are structured within a broader plan, and the difference that having no fences, right? So do you know your neighbour? These are some of the questions that we ask our communities. How we can incorporate shared spaces, so like marakai or playgrounds and sports and recreation, where our tamariki can, spend time together. And so design has a huge role in fostering a lot of those community connections. But I think there's still a level of individuality in the way in which we understand, design and planning that needs to shift. Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that I could speak to, and I know that particularly from an Indigenous architecture lens, and the need to, rethink the way in which we're building homes across the world, really, and our role in terms of, reducing carbon emissions and having low impact on our urban environments is incredibly important. So there is, a small kind of movement towards recognizing that, but I know there are a lot of challenges that many have faced, especially in whareuku as well, here in Aotearoa, around the recognition of, certain design methods that aren't recognized perhaps in the building code, and whether there needs to be some reform around the way in which we are building and designing to ensure that they are, 100 years at least. And I know someone mentioned today around talking about, cross-laminated timber and other methods to think about, how we can use more cost-effective methods to build the diversity of homes that are needed. So I'm not sure Aotearoa is at that stage already for that, but I hope that this kind of wave of, young aspiring Māori and Pacific architects are now having these types of conversations to allow people to rethink what that might look like and reimagine our built environments, which is really important. So that's also really exciting. But I think definitely a lot of work that is needed in that space. Thinking about climate change and our response to think, how do we integrate both approaches through a climate change lens and a housing lens? It's quite fragmented at the moment, but there's a strong need to integrate the approaches. So I know we are doing some pilot programs around that space to think about this idea of low carbon neighbourhoods and what that looks like by measuring essentially the supply chain and where materials come from. But even that has required significant investment to be able to showcase what they could look like. So still definitely a lot of work that's required in that space as well. Oh, that's a good one. I think the first one that probably comes to mind is around, what is the change that you want to see, right? And for me, as a young Māori woman, I want to be able to see not only like my children and tamariki, but I want them to grow up in cultural abundance, where they know their maunga, where they know their awa, and the moana, and the places that they come from, and not have to live through racism and, the stigma around what it means to be Māori. But it is a place where we can thrive in our cultural identity, where we can stay connected to whānau and to community, and ensure that we live collectively within the whānau, kinship, and have access to that. So for me, that's probably the change that I want to see. And we can do that through different avenues of work, whether that's housing and education. So a long way, but I really want to hold that in my heart, and ensure that, that is a part of my contribution through this work. So yeah, I think that's probably the question and answer that I would ask myself.